The grandeur of the Randolph estate was undeniable. Nestled in the rolling hills outside the city, the mansion stood as a monument to old money, white stone columns, perfectly manicured gardens, and an air of silent arrogance that seemed to whisper through its towering archways. Inside, beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and the watchful gaze of long-gone ancestors whose portraits lined the mahogany walls, the most anticipated wedding of the year was about to begin. Jacqueline Morris stood before a gilded mirror in the bridal suite, her hands resting lightly on the bodice of her gown. The dress was exquisite. Ivory satin, an intricately beaded bodice that shimmered under the soft light. A gown made for a fairy tale. But Jacqueline had learned long ago that fairy tales were for the naive. She was not one of them. Her dark skin glowed against the pale fabric, her hair styled to perfection, her expression composed. Yet beneath the carefully curated exterior, something felt off. She had ignored the feeling for months, dismissing it as wedding nerves, but now, with the moment upon her, the unease was suffocating. This was not a marriage built on love. Thomas Randolph, her fiancé, checked every box that high society deemed desirable: tall, polished, well-educated, and most importantly, from a lineage that dripped with generational wealth and influence. But the Randolph name, once untouchable, had begun to fade. Their fortune, once a tidal wave, had receded to a fragile stream hidden behind an illusion of grandeur. The Morris family, in contrast, was power forged from the ground up. Her parents, self-made billionaires, had built an empire that revolutionized the world of technology and finance. Respect followed them like a shadow in every room they entered. This marriage, they believed, was not about romance. It was about strategy, a merger of old wealth and new power. Her mother, Camille Morris, had called it an opportunity. Her father, ever pragmatic, had reassured her that love was fleeting, but power endured. And so, Jacqueline had agreed. At first, Thomas intrigued her. His charm was effortless, his confidence unshaken. But the cracks soon showed. His words, veiled in civility, carried a quiet contempt for those he deemed lesser. He dismissed her career, reducing her brilliance to a mere hobby, despite the fact that she was one of the youngest and most sought-after business strategists of her generation. Worst of all, he spoke of their union as if it were a favor, as if by marrying her, he was elevating her. The thought made her stomach turn. A sharp knock pulled her from her thoughts. The door swung open, revealing her mother in a gown nearly as elaborate as her own. Camille's presence commanded attention without effort. Behind her, Edward Morris stood, his sharp eyes scanning his daughter, searching for doubt. "You look perfect," Camille said, adjusting a curl near Jacqueline's temple. "Everything is going exactly as planned." Jacqueline forced a smile. "Of course." Her father stepped forward, resting a firm hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" A simple question, a loaded one. She was not, but she nodded anyway. Moments later, she descended the grand staircase, her steps measured, her presence effortless. Gasps rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward her. At the altar, Thomas stood waiting, his expression unreadable. He looked immaculate as expected. Tailored suit, polished shoes, the very image of sophistication. And yet when she reached him, when he took her hand in his, there was no warmth. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, polite applause. Their kiss was brief, rehearsed, devoid of passion. And just like that, it was done. Mrs. Jacqueline Randolph. The reception unfolded in the estate's sprawling gardens beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Champagne flowed freely, laughter danced through the air, and guests moved from table to table, basking in the spectacle of it all. Jacqueline played her role to perfection, smiling in all the right places, nodding graciously at each congratulation. Then it happened. A gasp, a sudden shift in energy. She barely had time to react before the wedding cake. An extravagant 5-tiered masterpiece adorned with gold leaf and sugar flowers. collided with her face. For a moment, silence. The world seemed to pause as thick layers of frosting smeared across her skin, the weight of the cake dragging her veil from its perfect placement. The cold, sticky sensation crawled down her neck, soaking into the delicate lace of her gown. Laughter erupted, not the light-hearted chuckles of amusement. No, this was something sharper, crueler, a room full of socialites reveling in the humiliation of a woman they never truly accepted. Jacqueline's breath came slow, steady. Her fingers curled at her sides as she wiped the frosting from her lashes. Across from her, Thomas smirked, his amusement barely contained. "It is just a joke, darling," he said smoothly, reaching for her hand. Something inside her snapped. The weight of every ignored instinct, every swallowed retort, every quiet insult she had let pass. It all came crashing down in that moment. Jacqueline did not speak. Instead, she reached for the bottle of vintage champagne, chilling in the silver bucket beside her. With one swift motion, she tipped it forward, the icy liquid cascading over Thomas's perfectly tailored suit. Gasps filled the air, followed by a stunned silence. Thomas reeled back, his expression morphing from amusement to rage. Jacqueline smiled, a real smile. She turned, stepping away from the mess, away from the man who had just humiliated himself far more than he had humiliated her. And with every graceful step, she knew she was no one's pawn. Not anymore. The Randolph estate shimmered under the weight of its own grandeur. From the outside, the wedding reception was flawless, a seamless blend of tradition, wealth, and status. Beneath a vast canopy of twinkling lights, elite guests moved effortlessly, sipping champagne from crystal flutes, their laughter weaving into the soft melody of a live orchestral quartet. Jacqueline Morris stood among them, the picture of practiced grace, her smile poised, her presence effortless. She was a woman who belonged in this world, or at least that was what she had been raised to believe. But beneath the surface, something inside her had shifted. She could still hear their voices. "Smart move on his part," one of the older businessmen had murmured, swirling his whiskey, tying himself to the Morris empire. "That girl's got the kind of money that could keep the Randolph name relevant for another century." The other man chuckled, his tone laced with amusement. He played it well. "She thinks she is getting a husband, but he is getting an investment." The words had cut through her like a blade. An investment. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute as she turned her gaze toward Thomas. He was across the room, laughing at something one of his friends said, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of an old flame who had always hovered too close. He had not even looked at her since they arrived. He did not need to. He had won. Perhaps she had always known the truth. This was not a marriage. It was a transaction, and she was the asset. A slow, burning realization settled in her chest. Jacqueline had spent her life being in control, dictating the terms, calling the shots. But standing here, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone, she understood something chilling. She had never been in control at all. Not yet. Camille Morris, her mother, glided beside her, regal as ever in a deep navy gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. She did not have to say anything at first. Her presence alone was a reminder, a warning. "Smile, dear," Camille finally murmured, her voice gentle yet firm. "People are watching." Jacqueline obeyed, forcing the corners of her lips upward. The smile felt foreign, like a mask that no longer fit. Camille's eyes flickered toward Thomas. "He is working the room well. That is good." There was no emotion in her words, just a quiet approval, as if all of this, the forced conversations, the calculated alliances, was nothing more than a well-executed game. "This is what we expected," she continued smoothly. "Expected? That word again." "You should mingle more," Camille added. "There are important people here tonight." Jacqueline's fingers curled tighter around her glass. Important to whom? Her mother did not miss a beat. "To you. To your future." A slow exhale left Jacqueline's lips. There was no point in arguing. Camille Morris had spent her life navigating rooms like these, understanding the mechanics of power better than anyone. To her, this was not just a wedding reception. It was a first move in a larger game. A game designed to ensure the Morris name held weight in circles even older than money itself. And Jacqueline was a piece that had just been played. Across the hall, Thomas caught her eye. He raised his glass slightly, a silent toast, a performance, a reminder. She returned the gesture, her movement smooth, practiced, but her stomach twisted with the realization that this was all she could expect from him now. A series of gestures, a partnership on paper. Yet, the cracks in his mask were starting to show. She saw it in the way he spoke to her family, the way his politeness felt strained, like an obligation rather than a sincere effort. When he greeted her father, Edward Morris, the handshake was firm but clipped. Their exchange was brief, filled with an unspoken tension that only those paying attention could recognize. Thomas had always been wary of Edward, perhaps because Edward was a self-made man, someone who had built an empire from nothing, while Thomas had inherited a name that meant less and less with each passing year. Or perhaps it was because Edward saw through him. "You have done well for yourself, Edward," Thomas said smoothly, but there was an edge beneath the compliment. Edward's smile did not quite reach his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice measured, "and I have made sure my daughter knows the difference between earned success and borrowed legacy." The implication hung in the air like a blade. For the first time that evening, Thomas faltered. Jacqueline saw it. The flicker of discomfort in his expression, the way his grip tightened around his glass. He recovered quickly, but she had already seen enough. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. She turned, stepping away from the conversation, away from the carefully curated illusion of her perfect wedding. The air outside was crisp against her skin as she made her way toward the grand fountain at the center of the estate. She had been played, but the game was not over. Not yet. And when Jacqueline Morris decided to play, she never lost. The air inside the Randolph estate was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged wine, and something far less tangible but far more suffocating. Tension, beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished smiles. It wove itself into the evening like an unspoken truth no one dared acknowledge. Jacqueline Morris sat at the head table, the very image of poise. She had spent years perfecting this role. The gracious heiress, the refined socialite, the woman who belonged in rooms like these. But tonight, she felt like an outsider in her own life. Across the room, Thomas played his part well. He was effortless, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, slipping into conversations about politics, finance, and power as if he had been born to it. His laughter rang out at just the right moments. His smile never faltered. And yet, Jacqueline saw it, the slight downing of his lips when someone mentioned her success instead of his. The way his fingers clenched ever so slightly around his glass when her name carried weight in a conversation. The flicker of something dark in his eyes when her father, Edward Morris, clapped a hand on his shoulder and said, in his even, measured tone, "Your father would be proud." It was barely a second, a flicker of something unreadable passing over Thomas's features, but Jacqueline caught it before he masked it with an easy smile. "That means a lot," he replied smoothly, but there was no sincerity in his voice. Jacqueline watched the exchange, noting the way Thomas's jaw tightened just slightly before he turned away. She saw it again when he spoke to her younger brother, Malcolm. Malcolm had never liked Thomas. He had been polite, of course, because that was expected. But beneath the surface, his quiet skepticism had always bordered on something closer to disdain. "You are an interesting man, Randolph," Malcolm said, swirling his drink lazily. "Not the type I picture my sister with." Thomas's smile tightened. "And what type did you picture?" Malcolm chuckled, his gaze unwavering. Someone who knows what he is getting into. The tension between them was sharp enough to cut through the din of laughter and conversation. Jacqueline knew her brother well enough to recognize the warning in his words, and she knew Thomas well enough to see that he did not appreciate being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. His fingers curled slightly at his side, the only outward sign of irritation, before he let out a short, calculated laugh and excused himself. Jacqueline followed his movements, watched as he walked away, as he downed half his drink in a single swallow before handing off the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was losing control. She had always suspected that his patience was thin, that his temper, though hidden beneath layers of polished charm, was volatile. She had seen glimpses of it before, the sharpness in his tone when he was challenged, the way his grip tightened just a fraction too much when things did not go as planned. But tonight, the cracks were wider, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. The evening dragged on, and Jacqueline played her part as she always had, smiling, shaking hands, answering questions about their honeymoon, their future, their life together. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his performance. The devoted husband, the perfect son-in-law, the charming heir to a crumbling legacy. But she knew him now. She saw the exhaustion in the way he carried himself, the frustration he tried to bury beneath charm. And then she heard him. She had not meant to listen. She had simply been passing by, navigating the crowd, when his voice reached her ears. "The smartest move I have ever made," he was saying, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. His friends laughed. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them joked. Thomas shrugged. "That is what marriage is it not?" Jacqueline stopped breathing. For a moment, the world around her blurred. The sound of clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, the soft swell of orchestral music. None of it mattered. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see him, to see the way he leaned against the bar, relaxed, self-assured, to see the way he spoke about her, as if she were nothing more than a calculated decision. Her stomach turned. She had always known, had she not? Deep down, some part of her had always known. But hearing it like this, spoken so carelessly, so confidently, shattered whatever illusion she had still been holding on to. She was not his partner. She was a means to an end. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. Jacqueline Morris was not a woman who allowed herself to be used. And if Thomas Randolph thought this was his victory, if he believed he had won, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. She picked up a glass of champagne, her movements slow, deliberate. The polished mask she had worn all evening did not crack. It transformed. Her smile was no longer the soft, gracious one expected of a bride. It was sharper now, knowing, because the game had changed, and Jacqueline had never been one to lose. The grandeur of the Randolph estate was undeniable. Towering chandeliers bathed the hall in golden light. Crystal glasses clinked in celebration, and the murmurs of high society filled the air like a well-rehearsed symphony. But beneath the polished surface, an undercurrent of unspoken tension hummed between Jacqueline Morris and Thomas Randolph. She had expected it. As conversations drifted toward finances, Jacqueline felt the inevitable weight of expectation settle in. The Morris name was synonymous with wealth, new money but vast and undeniable. Her family had built an empire from the ground up, shaping industries in both technology and art. The Randolphs, once titans of industry, now clung to the remnants of their fading legacy. And Thomas had played the smartest game of his life. He had married into the future, but what he had not anticipated was that the Morris family did not give freely. "My wife and I were just discussing how beautifully this evening came together," one of Thomas's uncles mused, swirling his drink. "A grand affair. I imagine it cost a small fortune to orchestrate something of this scale." Jacqueline did not need to look at Thomas to feel his anticipation. She could sense it in the way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly, in the careful neutrality of his expression. He was waiting for her father to confirm what he had always assumed. that this spectacle was yet another generous contribution from the Morris fortune, a quiet offering from his wife's bottomless resources. Edward Morris, however, was not a man who catered to assumption. Well, her father said, taking a measured sip of his whiskey, we made sure that the financial responsibilities were split fairly. This was, after all, a union of equals. The words were smooth, deliberate, and they landed like a hammer against glass. Jacqueline did not need to turn her head to know what Thomas was feeling. Fury. For months, he had operated under the belief that marriage to her would grant him unrestricted access to the Morris wealth, that whatever financial struggles his family faced would be swiftly erased by his new position. There had been signs along the way, casual remarks about how fortunate she was, offhand jokes, thinly veiled in humor, about how he had hit the jackpot, and then more recently, the subtle but telling suggestions that she need not work so hard. It had never been about love. Thomas had expected her to be an extension of his ambitions. Her wealth, a silent dowry, merged seamlessly into his own assets. And now, with the realization sinking in that the Morris family did not hand out blank checks, not even to their own blood, Jacqueline knew he was seething. He recovered quickly, of course. A partnership, he said smoothly, lips curling into a practiced smile. That was always the intention, but she heard it, the sharp edge beneath his words. The rest of the table had moved on, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. But Jacqueline remained hyper-aware of the man beside her, the tight clench of his jaw, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the pristine white tablecloth. For the first time that evening, she felt something close to satisfaction. The dinner portion of the reception concluded, and guests moved freely throughout the estate. Some gathered by the open bar. Others strolled onto the grand balcony, where a second orchestra played beneath the stars. Jacqueline slipped away into the gardens. She needed space, air, clarity, but she had barely stepped onto the stone pathway when she heard footsteps behind her. Thomas. She did not need to turn to know it was him. He fell into step beside her, silent for a moment, hands tucked into his pockets. And then, quietly, but with the unmistakable undertone of restrained anger, he said, I did not realize your family was so calculating. Jacqueline inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Splitting costs fairly. A union of equals, he repeated, his voice laced with something sharp. Then he let out a humorless laugh. That is an interesting way of putting it. She knew what he meant. It was not about the money itself. It was about what it symbolized. By refusing to bankroll the wedding entirely, her family had sent a message, one Thomas had not been prepared for. They were not handing him a key to the vault. Jacqueline turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. The charming mask he wore so effortlessly was gone, replaced by something colder. Humiliation. He had spent his life believing he was superior to people like her. Yet here he was, dependent on her. And she saw it. The truth etched into his expression. This was not a partnership. This was war. A quiet war, waged through sharp words and veiled threats. And tonight, the first battle had been won. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Thomas returned to his performance, laughing with guests, commanding the room with effortless charisma. But Jacqueline saw through it now. She saw the cracks, the resentment simmering beneath his skin, the way he smiled just a little too tightly, the way his grip on his glass lingered a second too long. She should have felt uneasy, but instead, she felt something else. Power, because for the first time since this engagement had been arranged, she was the one with the upper hand. Thomas had believed he was marrying into wealth, but he had underestimated her, and tonight, he had realized his mistake. The air inside the Randolph estate was still thick with the weight of the evening's revelations. The carefully constructed image of the perfect wedding remained intact, but beneath it, the foundation had already begun to crack. The grandeur of the evening masked the tension that simmered beneath the surface. To the world, it was a picture-perfect reception. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors. But Jacqueline Morris knew better. She moved through the reception hall with effortless grace, wearing the same poised smile she had mastered over years of navigating high society. She was not just smiling, though. She was watching Thomas, her new husband, as he charmed the guests with his smooth, effortless manner. Watching the way his fingers tightened subtly around his champagne flute whenever the conversation veered toward business, financial stability, or partnerships. He had not spoken to her since their exchange in the garden. She knew why. He was calculating, weighing his options, considering his next move. But Jacqueline had seen through him now. She understood him in a way she had not before. Thomas Randolph had been raised with the belief that power and status were his birthright, not because he had earned them, but because of the name he carried. But tonight, that illusion had been shattered. His family's wealth was not what it once was. And more importantly, Jacqueline was not the lifeline he had assumed she would be. She had seen the look in his eyes when he realized that the Morris family would not be writing blank checks. It was the look of a man who had lost control. And men like Thomas did not take well to losing control. The shift became undeniable during their first dance. The orchestra played a sweeping melody as the guests cleared the floor, their eyes trained on the bride and groom. Jacqueline felt Thomas's hand press against the small of her back as he led her into the dance. Their movements were synchronized, flawless, exactly as expected. But beneath the surface, beneath the practiced elegance, she felt it. The tension in his grip, the way his fingers pressed just a little too hard against her waist. A silent warning, a reminder. "You have been quiet," he murmured, his voice low, controlled. "So have you," she responded lightly, as if unaffected. His lips curled, but there was no warmth in his expression, only calculation. Step after step, they danced, locked in a silent battle of wills. Once, Jacqueline had imagined this moment differently. She had allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just for a second, she would feel something real. But there was no tenderness in the way he held her, no love in the way he guided her across the floor. Only expectation, only resentment. When the dance ended, Jacqueline excused herself, seeking a moment of solitude. She moved toward the grand staircase, away from the watching eyes, away from the weight of expectations pressing down on her. And then she heard them, low voices, male laughter, just beyond the arched doorway of the cigar lounge, a private space reserved for the Randolph elite. She might have walked past. She might have ignored it. But then, she heard her name. "The smartest move I ever made," Thomas's voice carried, casual, arrogant. A round of amused chuckles followed. "You say that like it was difficult," someone teased. "Come on, Randolph. We all saw it. She's the prize of the century." Jacqueline felt her breath still. "She's an investment," Thomas corrected smoothly. "The kind that pays off in the long run." Laughter, agreement, a slow, icy realization settled over Jacqueline. She had suspected, of course, somewhere deep down, she had known that this marriage was never about love. But hearing him say it so plainly, so openly, without a trace of shame, that was different. She could have walked away then, let him bask in his self-importance, let him believe he had won. But she did not. Instead, she stepped through the arched doorway. The laughter stopped instantly. Thomas, lounging in a leather chair, looked up, his smirk frozen in place as the air in the room shifted. The other men exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain whether to stay or leave. Jacqueline held his gaze as she stepped further inside, her expression unreadable. "Do not stop on my account," she said lightly. It sounded like a fascinating discussion. Silence. Thomas's fingers curled slightly around the armrest of his chair. A flicker of irritation crossed his face at being interrupted, at being caught. "Jacqueline," he said smoothly, attempting to regain control. "An investment," she finished for him, her voice even. The room tensed. One of the men cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. Jacqueline took another step closer. It was the first time since the ceremony that she had truly looked at Thomas, and now she saw him for exactly what he was. A man who thought he had won. A man who had spent his life believing that his name alone made him untouchable. But he had underestimated her. She was Jacqueline Morris. She had built herself on more than just a name. And Thomas Randolph had just made the gravest mistake of his life. She did not need to say anything more. She let the weight of her silence settle in the room, let it sink into the space between them. Then, with quiet, deliberate grace, she turned and walked away. By the time she returned to the reception hall, the celebration was in full swing. Guests laughed and danced, oblivious to the fracture that had just formed beneath the surface. But Jacqueline knew. She had seen the truth for what it was. And she knew one thing for certain. This war between them had only just begun, and she intended to win. The grand ballroom sparkled under the glow of crystal chandeliers, casting golden reflections over a sea of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and music filled the space, but beneath the dazzling spectacle, an unspoken tension pulsed, like the hush before a storm. Jacqueline Morris moved through the crowd with a grace, so refined it was almost practiced, because it was. Years of maneuvering through high society had taught her the art of appearing unshaken, of smiling even when the ground beneath her felt uncertain. But tonight, she was not just smiling. She was watching. Across the room, Thomas Randolph stood exactly where she expected him to be, surrounded by men who still believed in the illusion he carefully maintained. His laughter was rich, his charm effortless. But Jacqueline had seen the cracks beneath that polished veneer. She had felt them in the way his fingers tightened around her waist during their first dance, in the controlled sharpness of his words when they spoke alone, and most of all, in the way his entire demeanor had shifted the moment he realized that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. For the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph had lost control. And Jacqueline, she was just getting started. She did not need to look for him to know he was watching her, but the weight of his gaze did not move her. Instead, she felt another presence at her side, a familiar one. "You good?" Her brother Malcolm's voice was quiet, steady, but laced with something only she could detect: concern. She let out a slow breath. "I will be." She glanced across the room once more, catching Thomas's gaze just as he turned away. He had not dared to look at her since she walked out of the cigar lounge, since she had heard him, since he knew that she knew. The wedding reception had reached its crescendo. Glasses clinked, the orchestra swelled, and guests reveled in the splendor of the evening, oblivious to the undercurrents shifting beneath their feet. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the cutting of the wedding cake, a masterpiece of white and gold. The towering confection stood beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, a symbol of unity, of partnership, of the first act a couple performs together as husband and wife. Jacqueline had once imagined this moment differently. But then again, she had once imagined a great many things differently. She moved toward the cake, her movements deliberate, poised. Thomas was already there, waiting. His smile was effortless, a mask he had perfected over the years. But Jacqueline saw through it now. He was still fuming from their last encounter, still simmering over the humiliation of being denied the financial access he had expected, of being caught speaking about her as if she were nothing more than an asset. He was a man who had never faced true consequence. But tonight he would. The cameras flashed as they reached for the silver knife together. Their fingers brushed, but there was no warmth, only the weight of what neither of them dared to say aloud. They sliced through the first layer, a clean, precise motion. Polite applause followed. Then came the tradition, the moment where the newlyweds fed each other the first bite. Jacqueline hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She took a small piece, carefully balanced it on her fork, and lifted it toward his lips. Thomas accepted it, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he chewed. And then it was his turn. She knew what was coming before it happened. She saw it in the way he took a much larger piece than necessary. She saw it in the way his fingers clenched just a fraction too tightly. She saw it in his eyes, the need to reclaim power in whatever petty way he could, a flicker of anger, a bruised ego, and then, with swift, deliberate force, Thomas shoved the cake directly into her face. Gasps rippled through the room. For a brief, suspended moment, time itself seemed to freeze. A thick layer of sugary frosting smeared across her cheek, her lips, her eyelashes. The cream dripped onto the delicate lace of her gown, stark against the pristine white fabric. A few guests let out nervous laughter, uncertain, uneasy. Was this part of the celebration? A playful moment between newlyweds? But Jacqueline was not laughing. She did not wipe it away. She did not step back. She did not react. Not immediately. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what he had just done settle into the air for everyone to feel. Thomas had expected laughter, expected that people would brush it off, that she would play along, that she would smile through it as if it were nothing more than an innocent joke. But Jacqueline Morris was not a woman who tolerated being made a fool of, and Thomas Randolph had just overplayed his hand. The whispers began. Did that just happen? He threw that cake right in her face. That wasn't playful. That was... A sharp clink punctuated the murmurs as someone hastily set down their glass. Out of the corner of her eye, Jacqueline saw her father rise from his seat. Her mother placed a gentle but firm hand on his arm, a silent warning. Not yet. Not here. Jacqueline inhaled slowly, without a word. She reached for the linen napkin beside her, and then, with slow, deliberate precision, she wiped the frosting from her face. Her fingers were steady, her movements unhurried, and when she finally met Thomas's gaze, she saw it. The flicker of realization, doubt, uncertainty, regret. He knew. Maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, long enough to ensure that everyone in the room felt it. Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. The band played. The guests drank. The staff moved with forced cheerfulness. But the illusion had been shattered. And as Jacqueline stepped away from the spectacle, away from the man who had mistaken her silence for submission, she knew this was not the end. This was just the beginning. Jacqueline moved through the crowd, her every step measured, her every breath steady. The grandeur of the evening was overwhelming. Laughter echoing against the crystal chandeliers, the scent of roses and expensive champagne thick in the air, but none of it touched her. Not tonight. A presence shifted beside her, familiar, steady. Her brother, Malcolm. "You good?" His voice was quiet, but knowing. She exhaled slowly. "I will be." Across the room, right where she expected, stood Thomas, still playing the part, still cloaked in the illusion of charm and effortless control. But she knew the truth now. He had not looked at her since they left the cigar lounge. And she knew why. Because for the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph had realized he was no longer in control. And Jacqueline? She was just getting started. The reception had reached its peak. The ballroom pulsed with energy, a symphony of wealth and indulgence. Crystal glasses clinked, conversations hummed, and beneath it all, Jacqueline felt it, the shift, the unraveling. Thomas was breaking. She had seen the signs all night, the tightening of his grip during their dance, the way his words sharpened when he spoke to her in the garden, the moment her father made it clear that he would not be the financial lifeline Thomas had counted on. She had watched his frustration simmer beneath the surface, held back only by the thinning threads of his ego. And now, she could feel it coming, the moment where the resentment, the humiliation, would spill over. A towering masterpiece of white and gold was wheeled onto the main stage, the wedding cake gleaming under soft candlelight. The crowd turned their attention, anticipation thick in the air. This was the moment. The carefully curated tradition, the picture-perfect scene that would immortalize them as husband and wife. She had imagined it differently once. Then again, she had imagined a great many things differently. She moved toward the cake, her steps deliberate. Thomas was already there, waiting, a practiced smile on his lips. But she saw through it. Beneath the facade, he was still fuming, still stewing over the fact that she had humiliated him. Not once, but twice. First, by denying him the wealth he had expected. Then, by catching him in the act of belittling her. Thomas Randolph had always believed himself untouchable. Tonight, he had learned otherwise. A silver knife was placed in her hand. He reached for it as well, his fingers brushing against hers. The weight of the blade felt heavier than it should have. Together, they cut through the first layer. A clean, precise motion. Polite applause. Camera flashes. Then, the part everyone was waiting for. She lifted a small piece onto her fork, steady, careful, before offering it to him. He accepted it, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he chewed. His turn. She knew what was coming before it happened. She could see it in his grip, the way he took a much larger piece than necessary. In his eyes, there was something dark, something vindictive. And then, the cake smeared across her face. Thick, sticky frosting clung to her skin, dripped onto the delicate lace of her gown. The laughter that Thomas had been expecting never came. Silence. A weighted, suffocating silence. The air in the room shifted. Guests hesitated, caught between disbelief and discomfort. Someone's glass clinked hastily against the table. Someone whispered, hushed but urgent. Did that just happen? That was not playful. Her father stood, out of the corner of her eye. She saw her mother press a hand to his arm, stopping him. Not yet. Not here. Jacqueline inhaled slowly. She reached for the napkin on the table, wiping the frosting from her cheek in a single, deliberate motion. Every move controlled, every second stretching, pressing down on Thomas with an unbearable weight. And for the first time that night, she saw it. Doubt, uncertainty, the flicker of realization in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. No anger, no words, just silence. Then, without a word, without a single glance back, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. The band resumed playing. The servers continued serving. Guests tried to pretend, but the energy had shifted. The illusion had cracked. Jacqueline did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she ascended the grand staircase, the weight of the night pressing down on her with every step. The doors to the private bridal suite closed behind her with a finality that felt like the turning of a page. She stood before the mirror, staring at her own reflection. A woman covered in the remnants of what should have been a celebration. A woman who had allowed herself for too long to believe she could control this marriage on her own terms. She should have known better. A knock at the door. She did not need to ask who it was. Her mother entered first, composed but unreadable. Her father followed, his expression sharp, his anger barely restrained. "You do not have to make any decisions tonight," Camille said softly. But Jacqueline already had. She met her mother's gaze in the mirror, her voice steady. "This is over." And for the first time that night, she felt relief. She had been waiting for a reason. Now, she had won. The final, undeniable confirmation that she could never, would never, spend her life with a man like Thomas Randolph. She had once believed she could outmaneuver him, that she could play the game better, that she could bend the rules to suit her own power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be degraded. And Jacqueline Morris did not belong to anyone. By the time the night was over, Thomas would know that. And by the time the world woke up tomorrow, so would everyone else. Jacqueline stood in the bridal suite, the weight of the night pressing against her chest like an immovable force. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. The delicate lace of her gown, now ruined, clung to her skin like a cruel reminder of everything she had ignored, everything she had convinced herself she could control. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the vanity. Not out of fear, not even out of sadness, but from the sheer force of what she was holding back. Months of doubt, quiet humiliations, the slow, suffocating realization that she had let herself be led into a marriage built on nothing but illusion. A sharp knock at the door shattered her thoughts. She did not answer. She did not need to. The door opened anyway. Her mother, Camille, entered first, moving with the kind of effortless poise that had always made her untouchable. The soft glow of the chandelier made her gown shimmer, but it could not hide the quiet rage in her eyes. Behind her, Edward, Jacqueline's father, followed, closing the door with deliberate finality. His presence filled the room, heavy with unspoken fury. For a long moment, no one spoke. "You do not have to go back down there," Camille finally said, her voice even, careful, yet laced with something unmistakable. Jacqueline met her mother's gaze through the mirror, seeing the truth in it. This was not just about tonight. It was not just about the cake Thomas had smeared across her face in front of hundreds of guests. It was about every time she had dismissed the warnings, every time she had chosen to believe she could outmaneuver him. Edward exhaled sharply, pacing toward the window. He ran a hand over his jaw, as though trying to restrain himself. Jacqueline had seen her father furious before, but never like this. Never with a rage so quiet, so controlled, so dangerous. She turned, meeting them both head-on. "This is over." Her mother did not flinch. Edward stopped pacing. Camille tilted her head slightly, searching her daughter's face for hesitation, for doubt, for any trace of weakness. She found none. "Good," Edward said, his voice like steel. "Because if you were not walking away from this, I would have dragged you out myself." A breath escaped Jacqueline's lips, steadying her. Her mother reached for her hands, squeezing them. "You do not have to make a statement tonight," Camille said, her voice softer now. "But tomorrow, when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand. And they would. There would be no carefully worded press releases. No attempts to salvage this. She would not be the woman who stayed. She would not be the wife who endured disrespect with a smile. She would be the woman who walked away." Another knock, louder this time. Edward opened the door before Jacqueline could respond, revealing Malcolm. Her brother's expression was dark. "He is coming up here." The air in the room shifted. Camille let out a quiet, tired sigh, as though she had expected this, but had hoped for a little more time. Edward's jaw tightened. Of course, Thomas would come. Men like him always did. They pushed. They tested limits. They demanded explanations when things did not go their way. But tonight, Thomas Randolph was about to learn a lesson he had never been taught before. Jacqueline straightened her shoulders, smoothing down the fabric of her ruined gown. Then, with the same quiet power her mother had carried all her life, she turned toward the door. "Let him in." Malcolm hesitated. Edward tensed. But Jacqueline had already decided. If Thomas believed this night was not over yet, he was about to realize just how wrong he was. The door swung open before Thomas could even knock. For a fleeting second, he hesitated. Then he stepped inside, the scent of whiskey and cigars clinging to his tailored suit, a stark contrast to the delicate vanilla and orchids that filled the room. His eyes swept over the scene. The ruined gown, the unwavering expression on Jacqueline's face, Camille standing beside her like an unmovable force, Edward positioned near the door like a silent warning, and Malcolm leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable but lethal. Thomas had always been good at controlling a room, but this was not his domain. Still he tried. He forced a smirk, as if the weight of the evening could be laughed away. "I came to talk." Jacqueline did not move. She did not blink. She only watched. The silence stretched between them, thick, unbreakable. He had expected rage, tears, some kind of outburst he could twist, manipulate. Instead, she gave him nothing. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice, once confident, now wavered just slightly. "Walk away from this marriage over a joke." Still nothing. The realization crept into his face, slow and painful. Tonight, for the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph was beginning to understand what it felt like to lose. I want this done cleanly, quietly, and permanently. No drawn-out discussions. No second chances. Edward's nod was firm, the steel in his eyes reflecting the promise of a man who never failed to protect what was his. He had held back for her sake, out of respect for the dignity she had chosen to uphold tonight. But now, with her decision made, he would ensure that Thomas Randolph was nothing more than a name in her past. Camille stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on Jacqueline's shoulder. "You were never meant for a life that required you to shrink," she murmured. "You did the right thing." Jacqueline exhaled, releasing the last remnants of the weight she had carried for far too long. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she could breathe. The chains of expectation, of compromise, of forced endurance had shattered, and in their place, a new certainty had taken root. Across the room, Malcolm smirked. "He's going to regret ever thinking he could keep you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Regret," she said softly, "is a luxury he no longer has." The air in the room shifted, finality settling over them like a quiet storm. Jacqueline glanced toward the door, where Thomas had exited just moments before. It no longer felt like a door at all. It was a threshold she had crossed, one that led only forward. Without another word, she reached up and unpinned the last ornament from her hair, letting the final piece of this night fall away. Then, with the grace she had been born into but the strength she had forged on her own, she turned and walked out. Behind her, the past closed like a chapter that would never be reopened. The silver-framed mirror reflected her image back at her, but the woman staring into it was no longer a bride. She was something else entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the vanity, steadying herself, not out of fear, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer force of everything she was holding back. The weight of the months of doubt, the quiet humiliations, the realization that she had let herself believe she could control something that was never meant to be hers. She had been wrong. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, but she did not respond. The door opened anyway. Her mother entered first, moving with the same effortless poise she always carried. Camille's gown shimmered under the soft lighting, her expression composed, but her eyes burned with quiet rage. Edward followed, closing the door behind them, his presence thick with unspoken fury. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. His mere presence was a warning. Neither of them spoke at first. It was Jacqueline who broke the silence. "You do not have to go back down there," Camille said softly. Jacqueline met her mother's gaze through the mirror. This was not just about the cake. This was about everything. The warnings she had ignored. The choices she had made, believing she could handle a man like Thomas Randolph. Edward exhaled sharply, pacing to the side of the room, running a hand over his jaw as though trying to contain his anger. Jacqueline had seen her father furious before, but never like this. Never with a rage so quiet, so controlled, so dangerous. She turned to face them fully. "This is over." Her mother did not flinch. Edward stopped pacing. Camille inclined her head slightly, searching her daughter's face for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that Jacqueline might waver. She found none. "Good," her father said, his voice like steel. "Because if you were not walking away from this, I would have dragged you out myself." Jacqueline let out a slow breath, tension easing from her shoulders. Her mother reached for her hands, squeezing them gently. "You do not have to make a statement tonight," Camille said carefully. "But tomorrow, when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand. And they would. There would be no carefully worded PR statement. No attempts to salvage what was already beyond repair. She would not be the woman who stayed. She would not be the wife who tolerated disrespect. She would be the woman who walked away. Another knock at the door, this time sharper, more urgent. Edward opened it before Jacqueline could respond, revealing Malcolm standing there, his expression dark. "He is coming up here." The room tensed. Camille let out a soft, tired sigh, as though she had expected this, but had hoped for more time. Edward's jaw locked. Jacqueline did not need to ask who he meant. Of course, Thomas would come, because that was what men like him did. They pushed boundaries. They tested limits. They demanded explanations when things did not go their way. And tonight, he was about to learn that Jacqueline was done giving him any. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the fabric of her gown where the remnants of the cake still clung. Then, with the same effortless poise her mother had carried all her life, she turned toward the door. Let him in. Malcolm hesitated. Her father tensed. But Jacqueline had already made her decision. If Thomas thought this night was not over yet, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Because this was not just about what had happened at the reception. This was about power. And tonight, for the first time in his life, Thomas Randolph was about to understand what it felt like to lose it. The door opened before Thomas even had the chance to knock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside the bridal suite, his polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The room smelled of vanilla and orchids, a stark contrast to the heavy scent of whiskey and cigars that clung to him from the reception hall below. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the sight before him. Jacqueline, standing in the center, her gown still stained with the remnants of the cake he had shoved into her face. Her expression unreadable. Her mother, Camille, stood to her right, silent but imposing. Her father, Edward, positioned closer to the door, a physical barrier between Thomas and the only exit. And then there was Malcolm, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his stare a quiet warning. Thomas had always been good at controlling a room, but this was not his domain. He had come expecting anger, perhaps even tears. Instead, he was met with something far worse. Silence. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "I came to talk." Jacqueline did not move, did not blink. The silence stretched between them, thick and unbreakable. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of the room, it felt deafening. "Walk away from this marriage over a joke." Still nothing. His jaw tightened, his composure slipping. "This is ridiculous, Jacqueline. It was just a bit of cake. I was playing along with tradition." Everyone laughed. No one laughed. Her voice was steady, cold, the first word she had spoken to him since she had walked away downstairs. And they landed like a blade against his pride. His nostrils flared slightly, frustration mounting. "So that is it then? You are going to humiliate me in front of everyone, make a spectacle out of this over nothing." Her father shifted his stance, an unspoken warning. But Jacqueline did not need protection. She had already won. She had won the moment she refused to engage. The moment she stripped Thomas of the reaction he had been counting on. Finally, she moved just a step closer. Just enough to tilt her head slightly as she regarded him with something that was almost pity. "This was never going to work," she said softly, and the certainty in her voice made something inside him tighten. He had expected control. He had expected to dictate the terms. He had never expected to lose. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a woman who had already made up her mind. He let out a sharp exhale, his mask slipping for the briefest moment before forcing himself to smirk. "So what now?" he sneered. "You think you can just walk away? The world does not work like that, Jacqueline. People do not just get to rewrite the rules when they do not like them." She smiled then, but it was not the kind of smile he had ever seen from her before. It was not warm, not charming, not meant to soothe or comfort. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "I already have," and that was it. That was the end. Thomas stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone to tell him this was not real. But no one did, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Jacqueline Morris was done. Without another word, Thomas turned on his heel and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence swallowed the space he had occupied just moments before. Her mother exhaled slowly, her eyes filled with something unreadable. Her father nodded once, as if confirming what he had always known. Malcolm smirked slightly, unsurprised that Thomas had left without putting up more of a fight. And Jacqueline, she felt it, the weight lifting, the past closing like a chapter that would never be reopened. She turned toward the mirror one last time. Her reflection had changed. She was no longer the woman Thomas had expected her to be. She was something else entirely. She was free,